Hello, welcome to Union Baptist Church. You may or may not know this, but this is a very important place. I am going to tell you the story that the walls of this church cannot. You have actually likely learned about the events sparked by this church through your Civil War history lesson classes. But you probably never heard about this church because it was owned by slaves brought to Marion County in 1842, before Jefferson was officially a town. To honor those that sacrificed their lives protecting this church, and to the people who have worshiped here ever since it was founded, it's important that we tell their story. As you listen, I'd like to invite you, imagine yourself actually experiencing the events over the course of time. Feel the energy that radiates from the building walls as you experience this historically accurate narrative. I must warn you though, this Texas Registered Historic Landmark has a powerful story, and it may evoke your emotions. To fully appreciate the role this church has played in U.S. history, in Texas history, and in African American history, it is important to understand what was going on in the years before the structure was built, back during the birth of Jefferson, Texas. This is a story compiled by the surviving congregation, their family traditions they passed down, and by excerpts from historical documents and books. Furthermore, it is supported by the archaeological artifacts themselves that have been recovered from underneath the church. In 1841, Jefferson, Texas was established as a town on the muddy banks of the Big Cypress Bayou. Large logs blocked the river passage between Smithland and Jefferson, which prevented the town of Jefferson from growing. At this point, the town was relying on a ferry crossing to connect it to Marshall. Allen Urquhart owned and operated the ferry crossing, which connected the road from Marshall to the foot of Houston Street in Jefferson. The church itself sits at the foot of Houston Street in Jefferson, and if you were to look out one of the windows of the church toward the river, you can just imagine seeing a ferry crossing at the bottom of the hill. Among the first settlers in Jefferson was a steamboat captain named William Perry. Mr. Perry owned land in Jefferson, and in 1842, he owned lots 7, 8, and 9 of Block 86, and he deeded Lot 8 over to his slaves, who built a brush arbor church at the top of the hill, just above Urquhart's Ferry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this church today stands in Lot 8, Block 86, atop the hill, just above what was Urquhart's Ferry. In 1844, a plan was conceived by Allen Urquhart to remove the obstacles in the river and to finally open up safe passage to Jefferson. Steamboat Captain William Perry funded and oversaw the operation, and in less than a single year, in April of 1845, Captain Perry, through the hard work of his slaves, had cleared the last obstacle and opened up Jefferson, Texas, to the technology of steamboat transportation. After the bayou was cleared in April of 1845, James Buckner Berry was among the first visitors to the new Jefferson. Mr. Berry, who was a Texas Ranger and a frontiersman, described Jefferson quite vividly.
As sticky a place as exists under the sun. There are several houses under construction, but there was only one that was finished. A man served us with meat, bread, and black coffee using a very large pine log as a table.
With Jefferson now accessible by steamboat, the town began to grow, and so too did the congregation of that thatched arbor at the top of the hill above Urquhart's Ferry. By 1847, the congregation built a much more substantial structure that became locally known as the African Church. Over the next 14 years, Jefferson will continue to grow, and America will continue to divide. The backbone of the U.S. economy in the southern states became slavery, producing cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar commodities, in addition to the labor force that built the expanding growth, including that of booming Port Jefferson. The system exploited black labor and relied upon terrorizing the black community, and ending slavery would upend that system. In February of 1861, 7 southern states withdrew their membership, or seceded, from the United States of America. They declared themselves the Confederate States of America. This was an act of an organized rebellion against the United States constitutional government. And only a few short months later, in April of 1861, war broke out in America. This is known as the American Civil War, and the war was fought between the northern United States, also known as the Union States, and the southern United States, known as the Confederate States. The Civil War began primarily as a result of the long-standing controversy over enslavement of black people. Many battles were fought over the course of the next 5 years, with the last of the hostilities being reported in November of 1865. And on December 18th of 1865, the Secretary of State William H. Seward proclaimed the adoption of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which officially abolished slavery. From this point forward, slavery was no longer an acceptable legal practice in the United States of America, and former slaves were then referred to as freedmen. The Freedmen's Bureau was a program funded by the federal government to assist all formerly enslaved people into transitioning into freedom with vocational training, food assistance, help with labor contracts, provisions of clothing, legal aid, and education. They created schools for the newly emancipated, which later became known as historically black colleges and universities. And they established the precursors to the Rosenwald schools that were built for the emancipated children. These strides were all made possible by actions of the Loyal League, a group of African American abolitionists that worked within the legal system to change the U.S. Constitution as the main way to end slavery and to begin establishing rights for African Americans. Not long after the Civil War ended at the close of 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was founded. This organization used violence and terrorism to demonstrate their opposition to the abolition of slavery and the U.S. government policies of Reconstruction. The Klan had no official organization, but spread their message through word of mouth and commonly used different names. By March of 1868, Klan activity was well documented throughout Texas. Jefferson's Klan was known as the Knights of the Rising Sun. George W. Smith was a local leader and an advocate for the Freedmen's Bureau. And he was a radical Republican, a group that went beyond abolitionists and called for immediate, complete, and permanent eradication of slavery without compromise. Having fought in the Civil War himself, he was a Union veteran who moved to the booming Port Jefferson to start his own business. Here, he found himself involved in local politics and became an advocate for the freedmen's equality. As the threats grew against them, the freedmen were assisted by Smith with weapons and training to protect themselves, defending their property, this very church, which served as a hub for their civil rights activities during that time. The response from the Klan was to start a riot. By May of 1868, the first Klan murders of the freedmen and Republicans were known to have taken place. 3 months later, in August of 1868, letters found in multiple archives document the Klan killing Union Baptist church members. During this period, local authorities were not enforcing the law, and the judge of Marion County, Don Campbell, also considered a sympathizer for the freedmen, wrote to the Texas governor, E.M. Pease, in desperate plea for help.
Jefferson, Tuesday, August 25th, 1868. Honorable E.M. Pease, Austin. My dear sir, the excitement was much higher with us last night than it has ever been before. It came very near in resulting in a general riot and massacre. The Knights of the Rising Sun had a meeting about 5 o'clock in the town hall and invited Lieutenant Smith to be present. They had great complaints to make in regards to the Negroes being armed, but not a word to say in regards to the outrages reoccurring here every day and night by their war party. The Negroes feel that they have been outraged and that unless they protect themselves, they will be killed up by these outlaws. Threats have been made that their church is to be burned or torn down, and that they have simply armed themselves, and when night comes, they go to their church and await any attack that may be made upon it. They interfere with no one, and will interfere with no one, but have determined if their church is attacked, to die in defending it. Last night, a party of Ku Kluxers went out to attack them, but through the efforts of Lieutenant Smith and several others, it was prevented. During the night, however, the wildest excitement prevailed all over our city. Horsemen from the direction of the church were running at full speed. The hall bells were rung 5 or 6 times. Yelling and shooting and all manners of things were done to alarm the loyal men and freedmen. It was feared at the time that the troops would be attacked, and they stood with their guns in their hands, ready to resist them. It is understood here that 300 of the expected troops have reached Marshall. If so, may we expect them here very soon? But when they come, will it be sufficient if the rebels will be quiet until they are withdrawn? They must be hunted up and punished. They must be made to fear a violation and resistance of the authorities of the United States. Without it, all will go for nothing. Turning outlaws and assassins over to the civil authorities amounts to their sure release. They must be tried by military commissioners the moment they are caught and dealt with as they deserve. Yours truly, D. Campbell.
While we just heard Judge Don Campbell telling of riots and an avoided massacre at this church, the very next day the Texas Governor EMPs will be referred to in yet another letter concerning this very church. This time, it will be from a Union Army sergeant stationed in town, and this time an assassination will not be avoided. The local Klan assassinated Union Baptist Church member Albert Browning in a very violent manner, as described by Sergeant W.H. Johnson in this graphic letter to the Texas governor.
Jefferson, August 26, 1868. Honorable EMPs, Austin. Sir, last night, about 10 o'clock, Albert Browning, a freedman, one of the quiet, inoffensive citizens of our city, was taken out from his bed in the presence of his wife and little children, his hands tied behind him, and after being robbed of his money and many articles of wearing apparel, also a gun, pistol, and his horse, was led a short distance from his house and shot simultaneously from different guns or pistols. From there, they proceeded to the African church, tied their horses, and commenced breaking down the doors. Freedmen who were guarding their church fired upon them, and they ingloriously fled. Since that time, our city has been in a blaze of excitement, not so much on account of the assassination, as from the assemblage of freedmen at their church every night for the purpose of protecting their property, which is certainly their right, since the civil authorities failed to do it. On Monday night, the excitement became most intense. Mounted men, well armed, were riding through the city, swearing vengeance against the freedmen at their church. The citizens called a meeting, and the crowd was harangued by excited orators. D.B. Culverson attacked Judge Don Campbell, said he had organized the Loyal League here, and that such men were accountable for all of this excitement and should be held accountable for anything that might happen, etc., etc., and was generally very bitter against radicals, and all this in a public harangue to a then infuriated crowd. At a time when Campbell had been compelled to leave his house and come to town and conceal himself as best as he could at night to save his life, night after night his house was surrounded by armed men, attempted to decoy him out by professions of friendship, assuming the names of his friends, forced freedmen from their houses and ordered them to entice Campbell out, and because they refused, tortured them by putting their heads under the corners of fences and keeping there until life was almost extinct. I could give you many other instances of torture for similar purposes. The civil law is blank here. Protection we must have soon, or else all Union men will have to leave this country. Hoping we may have protection soon, I am very respectfully your obedient servant, Sergeant W.H. Johnson.